It was established in 1997. It has today around 600,000 photographs, and the images are organized into collections. So by collections we mean basically groups of items that have the same provenance. So whether it's the photographer, the collector, the family who gave those images. The collections. Maybe I'll just stop.
She's called the Susu. Susu the dancer.
So the collections include smaller collections, but also large ones, such as the one related to Hashim al-Madani, who's a photographer from Sidon, which is a city in Lebanon. Another big collection is Rifat Shadaji, who's an Iraqi architect and photographer. And what's interesting is that those two collections are actually examples of different ways in which the Arab Image Foundation collection actually expanded. So one, the Hashim al-Madani collection was actually brought through an artist-initiated initiative, and the other one, Rifat Shadaji, was actually the photographer himself bringing this collection to the Arab Image Foundation as a long-term deposit. So the Arab Image Foundation collection has been shaped both by its mission to preserve old photographs from the region and also through the initiatives which were led by its members in terms of research and artistic projects. So it's a very dynamic entity. It's also very idiosyncratic, as you can see from the different images. It illustrates the history of photography in the region through the different photographic practices, but it also situates those practices in the historical context, so whether it's social, political, economic, cultural context of the different places at the time.
The one-dimensional.
So most of the collection is from the 1920s and 60s, and so it really kind of corresponds to the period of modernization in this area, and this can also be traced to the evolution of the medium itself, the photographic medium itself. So we have different formats. We have negatives mostly, but also of course prints, glass plates, different kinds. I mean, if you get into the technicalities of the photographic formats. So over the years, the members have gathered material from different countries, not only the Arab countries, but also Turkey, Iran, places like Senegal and Mexico, where the Arab diaspora found itself in. Different genres, different styles, and different sources. It was very important in the acquisition process to really document the collections and the context in which they were, the photographs were taken. So by talking to the photographers, gathering information from the collectors, to make sure that, as much as possible, we could sort of understand the conditions in which those collections kind of were, came into being, and what conditions informed the practice of the photographers or the collectors, for that matter. And the collection was always meant to be diffused and made accessible to people. So the foundation has done that through exhibitions, through publications, and our space in Beirut is actually open to the public daily. So we have a research space and library where people can come in. We have an online database which doesn't have the 600,000 images, but it's already a start, and it's an ongoing process of digitization. So the collection has really been a resource, a valuable resource for artists, for academics, scholarly research, curatorial initiatives. And different projects have kind of touched on notions of memory, identity, history, as we've seen in, for example, these projects. So it's important when you're actually accessing the collection to not only understand the context in which the images were produced, but also the context in which they were collected and the context in which the foundation was established initially. So I'd like to quote here Jacques Derrida. This is from Archive Fever, A Freudian Impression. I'm sure many of you probably know this. So he says, the archive is not only a radically unstable form of inscription, it is also always haunted by the moment of inscription and the traces of its own ontological coming into being. So the AIF was founded by initially 3 people, the Akram Zaatari, some of you might know his work, Fouad Al-Khouri, who's a photographer, and Samir Mohdad, who's also a photojournalist. It quickly grew to include new members, such as Walid Raad and Lara Baladi, for example, to name a few. It's important, to note that the foundation was established in a particular context, which is the one of post-war Lebanon, so in 1997, and that generation of artists and intellectuals were interested in in questioning their relationship to the recent history of the country. So this was in a larger context of, as was mentioned by Leslie, actually, the absence of an official narrative, a public narrative. They were also concerned with the absence of photographic archives, whether institutional or even private, and so they wanted to engage with or kind of explore more the local practices that had emerged locally and kind of move away from the Orientalist, exoticizing kind of imagery and representation of the region. They were interested in looking at the notion of representation locally and the way those images had circulated, the way people had chosen to be represented, and the way they used those images. Of course, in doing so, they also contributed to the preservation of that heritage and the diffusion of the work of many Arab photographers. So by working on its own collection, the Arab Image Foundation developed actually a kind of expertise in preservation, photograph preservation. So we have parallel activities or initiatives where we actually train collections in the region. And so we have this initiative called the Middle East Photograph Preservation Initiative. It's in partnership with the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Getty Conservation Institute, and the University of Delaware. And it has 2 components, a training component, so training people from the region who deal with photographic collections, and also a mapping component, so trying to map all the different collections. And we hope to have an online directory which hopefully can be used as a tool by researchers. So as I mentioned, the foundation from the beginning had a very special approach to collecting, because the act of collecting was always tied to the individual interests of the different members, their artistic interests, their research interests. For example, Akram Zaatari says, I see my research work as part of my artwork. I started to see images I bring to the foundation not as neutral images brought into an image bank, but as an artist's reflection on cultural and social iconography. So when we look at the collection, we can talk not only about a collection of photographic practices, but actually a grouping of collecting practices. Because this process of collecting, of selecting, was almost as a curatorial act. It was of course determined by other factors such as research opportunities, funding, timing, things like that. But the members were always very involved in bringing the collections to the Arab Image Foundation. There was no definite, there was a deliberate choice not to have a definite strategy of acquisition or vision, for the collection to grow. It was quite organic, and there was never, for example, the AIF never hired a historian to kind of, advise them on, the different gaps to fill. Also, the foundation never tried to become a photography museum, and it always stayed clear of kind of placing commercial value on the items in the collection. So really focusing on the content rather on the images as as objects. mean, it's important to say that, you know, it was always important for the foundation to have very clear image use policies, and, you know, we have copyright agreements and contracts with for every single collection, basically. So for the members, it actually became clear quite early that, you know, in a way they were sort of writing history, to sort of use that term. It became important to differentiate between the life of the photographs, you know, in their initial kind of environment, and then afterwards, once they were brought to the AIF. So there was kind of a first act of preservation by taking those collections, bringing them to the Arab Image Foundation. In a way, I mean, sometimes, you know, rescuing them, not always, I won't exaggerate, but it's in some cases. And then the second act of preservation, which basically happened at the Arab Image Foundation and is ongoing. So, and we have an archivist, for example, who, you know, sort of covers that area. The first act of preservation can, you know, be thought as an act of displacement. So you're taking, you know, material out of of its context. Some members would even say, you know, there's almost some like violence contained in that act or in that practice. And the attitudes towards preservation and towards different modes of acquisitions have changed. I think generally as a trend, and also within the IIF, and the members are quite, you know, sort of aware of that. They, you know, question their past approaches to collecting, and newer collections such as this one, the Rafat Shadaji collection, came, as I mentioned, in a very different way. So the photographer, the, you know, architect, had heard about the Arab Image Foundation, and there had been, you know, contacts over many years, and then after a period, I think of 10 years or more, he decided to entrust us with this collection, so as a long-term deposit. So maybe I'll just end by saying that, you know, this sort of fascination that, you know, some people might have with the collection of the Arab Image Foundation can be assimilated actually to the fascination, you know, people have with the archive with capital A, and of course, you know, what's often said about an archive is that the meaning is always in flux. It's you know, it's not fixed, and it's up to the user to actually do that. There's, you know, the potential of an archive is actually to be used. I mean, it doesn't really have any meaning if it's not used, and it's really up to the user to sort of navigate the pitfalls. And I think we've seen this in many of those projects, and that's something that the Arab Image Foundation members have also done through their own projects.